Hello, Adrian here. Well, now we want to actually sort of interact with our model in a bit more of a nuanced fashion. So we now have our two templates in here, and we want to actually be able to switch between them without having to jump between maps or drop new actors and stuff in. Oh, what's that? What's an actor, you say? And of course, what's a pawn, you might ask afterwards, because I haven't even mentioned that before, but you need to know what these are as actors and pawns. So actors and pawns are two major types of things within the game. And so in the most simplest of terms, and also you can actually hover over them, an actor over here is just basically an object. So all of these things are actors, and if you click on them, it'll say that they're actors. Pawns are a little different. Pawns actually have response and interactivity. So for instance, if you were playing, you would be actually manipulating a pawn with your actions, whilst if you had AI running around, you'd have AI driving a pawn around. And so they operate a bit differently, but the main thing to understand about them is that they are possessible. And that notion of possession, not like the sort of the poltergeist kind of possession or anything like that, but just, actually, no, it's actually pretty like that, isn't it? So you're taking over the body of this poor armed and headless, legless fellow with a camera for a face, and you're pushing him around. And so understanding that notion of possession is really important because it actually controls how you switch between things once you start getting into the world of interactivity. But the most important one is dealing with player start. And what player start is basically where you start the game and what you're controlling. Because if you just press play without any player start, you're just going to be kind of, well, nowhere, because you're not going to have a thing that you can look from. And Unreal actually is quite helpful in that it defaults. So if we, for instance, delete this guy and delete this network player start, which we're going to address in a second, and press play, we're just going to be a camera. And we can't do anything. I'm moving my mouse, I'm clacking my keys, but I can't do anything because it just defaults to putting a pawn that just has a camera strapped to it. And the reason for that is, and you can also undo those, thankfully, the reason for that is that it doesn't know what we're possessing because we've not told it to. And so in the blueprint, like the default, within the first-person template, it's quite helpful that it forces that we possess this object. And the way to check that is if we type in pawn, that little key term we mentioned before, we can see a whole bunch of things in here. And one of them is auto-possess player and auto-possess AI. And so we want this, by default it actually is set to 0, but I turned that off earlier on when testing out this video before I recorded, because I'm anxious like that. And we can set it to 1. And so what this will do, and also one other thing to note that's handy, is this gives you a preview of where you'll be looking, which is also handy if you want to curate or make a wow moment of your architecture, that you have them pointing in the right direction when they start. And so if we move this guy over here and make sure that auto possession is on, so it'll take control of player 0. And just to note, we count from 0 within most computer software and programming. So counting from 0, so player 0 is us, player 1 through whatever is like when people join from like network, like if you're playing an online multiplayer something or another. And so if we press play, we'll start over here because that's where we've moved our pawn. And we can pew ourselves around. But if we, for instance, want to start with a different blueprint, and when I say blueprint, blueprint is the sort of interaction within Unreal. So I'm not going to go into how to use blueprints, but I will just say that if I say blueprint, it's basically something that has response or interaction or does something more than just exists and is able to be pushed around. So being able to fire a gun requires that. So we're going to just delete that character, and we're going to have a look at this network player start. And what network player start allows, if we remove with this little X our filter so we can see everything, it sets up if a player spawns in from online or just starts in the map, they'll get put here. And what gets put here, I'll show you how to dictate in a second, but we can show which player it is. So I'm going to say player 0 because we know that that's us, and it'll start us here. And it'll break for a moment because we need to also make sure that we're defining what is starting here, because at the moment it's just going to give me that default sort of pawn, which is just a camera that looks in a direction. And so we want to set up what that's doing. And so If I go into Edit and Project Settings, a new scary place I don't believe we've gone before, we'll be able to edit the settings specific to this project, including the thumbnail that we can see here. And so what we want to look at is maps and modes in the project top left. And this is important in twofold, and usually this defaults to this view, just so you know, and you'll have the default game mode, but you're going to leave that as first-person game mode for the time being. But there's two really important things here. The first one is the starting map. So make sure you've selected the correct starting map. So do name your maps appropriately when you've saved them in here. But make sure you got the correct one selected, which is the first-person template map. Oops, we don't want that. We want default maps. Yep. So we make sure that that's in there. And we also want to make sure if we open up this selected game mode, we want to set our default class. And so we want to set our default class to first-person character in this case, so we can pew around. This will save automatically. We also want to select a HUD sometimes. So the first-person HUD is that little reticle that you see on it. So if I close this and press play, we'll have our little reticle and we'll have our first-person pawn. But I can demonstrate by pressing escape. We can go back to that menu, open up the project settings, and this is going to go horribly wrong for a reason I'll explain in a second. We're going to turn off our HUD. We're going to switch this to the we're going to go for the motion control pawn, so we can actually have hands and throw balls around and do other things like that, because that's what the Vive lets us do. We're going to press play. It's not going to do very much, and this is because we don't have a Vive plugged in. And so for the next video, we're going to look at how we actually plug in a Vive and use that, because without it, we can't do very much. So thanks for watching, and look forward to getting into VR. See you next video.
This project was supported by a UTS Widening Participation Strategy, First Year Experience Grant, funded through the Australian Government Higher Education Participation and Partnership Program. The videos were produced by Matthew Austin and Adrian Taylor.